welcome to our third episode of Spanish Answers. Really exciting, right? Anyways, so I thought today we would talk about pedir and preguntar. Now, in English, we only have one word when you want to ask something of someone, and that's obviously to ask. But in Spanish, they have two words. So you have pedir and you have preguntar, and the two cannot mix. So whenever you would translate them into English, obviously you're always going to translate them as to ask, but they have very distinct differences in how and when you use them. So let's go ahead and talk about it and hopefully help you in navigating their usage. All right, vámonos. Okay, so pedir means to ask. What's the difference? Well, pedir means to ask for something or to request something. For example, you want to ask for objects, you want to ask for services, permission to do something, you want someone to do you a favor, all of that. Some examples of this are, le pido clases de inglés. I asked him for English lessons. Now, please note here that pedir assumes the word for. So in English, we say, I asked him for, I asked her for, they asked me for. Pedir in Spanish assumes that. So you would say, le pido clases de inglés. You don't say, le pido por clases de inglés or le pido para clases de inglés. Nothing like that. You say le pido clases de inglés. Another example, me pidieron una manzana. They asked me for an apple. Me pidieron una manzana. So we're asking for things here. And then pedirle permiso. Ask her for permission. Pedirle permiso. Ask her for permission. And then finally, le pedí a la camarera más sopa. I asked the waitress for more soup. Le pedí a la camarera más sopa. I asked the waitress for more soup. Whereas with preguntar means to ask for information. Examples, le pregunté a la maestra sobre matemáticas. I asked the teacher about math. Le pregunté a la maestra sobre matemáticas. I asked the teacher about math. Ella me preguntó dónde está la escuela. She asked me where the school is. Ella me preguntó dónde está la escuela. She asked me where the school is. El profesor pregunta a la clase para probarla. The professor asks his class questions to test them. El profesor pregunta a la clase para probarla. El profesor pregunta a la clase para probarla. The professor asks his class questions to test them. So as you can see here, when you're asking or using preguntar, you are asking for information about something. So I have a question about math. I want a question as to where something is. The professor is asking us questions. All those things. You can also say hacer una pregunta, to ask a question. Preguntar and hacer una pregunta are pretty much the same thing. So in English, for example, we say, I would like to ask you a question. I have a question for you. In Spanish, preguntar is you are asking a question. So in Spanish, it's very redundant to say preguntar una pregunta. I mean, if you think about it, the verb practically has the question in it. Preguntar, pregunta. Very redundant. So they don't say that. They say if you want to ask a question, another way to say it outside of preguntar is hacer una pregunta. So you can also just say preguntar to ask someone. So some examples are, le hice una pregunta de matemáticas al maestro. I asked the teacher a math question. Le hice una pregunta de matemáticas al maestro. There's that hacer una pregunta. Then you've got él quiere hacerle una pregunta. He wants to ask you a question. Él quiere hacerle una pregunta. He wants to ask you a question. Now, hacer, as I'm sure you all remember, is the verb to make, to do. So in Spanish, you're literally saying, I want to make a question. I want to make a question to you, or I want to do a question to you, which is very odd in English, but again, this is how it is in Spanish. El profesor pregunta a la clase para probarla. The professor asks his class questions to test them. So we already saw this earlier, right? El profesor pregunta a la clase para probarla. So the professor asks his class questions to test them. Literally, it is the professor questions to the class in order to test it. So Daniel pregunta a Juan. Daniel asks Juan a question. Daniel pregunta a Juan. Daniel asks Juan a question. So again, hacer una pregunta and preguntar a are interchangeable. They both mean to ask a question. And again, please do not say preguntar una pregunta. You will get very odd looks. So you can also use preguntar with por or sobre. So if you use preguntar por, you're using it to ask about or for someone. If you use preguntar sobre, you are asking about something. So some examples. Cuando llames, pregunta por Rose. When you call, ask for Rose. Cuando llames, pregunta por Rose. When you call, ask for Rose. Rachel estaba preguntando por ti. Rachel was asking about you, or Rachel was asking for you. Rachel estaba preguntando por ti. Pregunté sobre el clima. I asked about the weather. Pregunté sobre el clima. I asked about the weather. Ella le preguntó sobre su cicatriz. She asked about his scar. Ella le preguntó sobre su cicatriz. She asked about his scar. So, pregunta por is you're asking about someone or you're asking for someone, like you want to see them, you're seeing if they're there, you're asking how they are. Or preguntar sobre is you're asking about something. So I want to know about your scar, I want to know about your health, I want to know about the weather, all of that. The last form of preguntar, as I'm sure you've noticed, this is a very diverse verb. So preguntarse is to ask yourself something or to wonder about something. Me preguntó por qué el cielo es azul. I wonder why the sky is blue. Me preguntó por qué el cielo es azul. I wonder why the sky is blue. So in English, we use the verb wonder. I wonder why the grass is green. I wonder why birds fly, all of that. But in Spanish, they use preguntarse. So me preguntó. I ask myself, why is the sky blue? Why is the grass green? I actually really like this, that they use the verb preguntarse to ask yourself something. So, se pregunta si tiene razón. He asks himself if he's right. Se pregunta si tiene razón. He asks himself if he's right. Se preguntaban quién era. They wondered who this was. Se preguntaban quién era. They wondered who this was. All right, so that's all for today. Please, if you have any questions or topics that you would like me to discuss, please send them to me at contact@languageanswers.com. That's contact@languageanswers.com. And if you like this episode, please subscribe, either on iTunes or Google Play, SoundCloud, YouTube, all of those places you can find me at, and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Also, if you like this episode, please click the like button on the YouTube channel or leave me a review on iTunes. Either one will really help. Alright, well I hope today has helped you with understanding when and how to use pedir and preguntar. But honestly, if you still have questions, please reach out to me. I'd be more than willing to help you. You can get a hold of me on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, my email, all of the above. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Now, I would like to make a clarification. I know on past episodes I've said I'll see you next week, but the truth is this podcast isn't published every week, so that's my mistake. I'm sorry. This one is published every other week. You see, I've got two. I have Spanish Answers and I have Respuestas Inglesas. So I alternate between the two podcasts. So technically, if you wanted to see me next week, then you could find me on Respuestas Inglesas. But for Spanish Answers, I will see you in 2 weeks. So, hasta luego!